The primary message is that the climate change issue is urgent. And, it's really hard for people to realize that because you don't notice slow climate change with large weather fluctuations from day to day. But in fact, we have reached a critical point. If we don't get on a different path within the next several years, then we're going to pass tipping points in the climate system with large consequences that will be felt especially by our children and grandchildren. But already we're beginning to see effects, and we need to begin to make changes really in the next few years, especially with the change of administration that will occur next year. This is the time to decide to make the changes. There is one thing which is just so clear from the geophysical facts. If you just look at the size of the carbon reservoirs, you see the main problem is carbon dioxide, which is caused by the burning of fossil fuels. But if you look at the different fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, you see that by far the largest one is coal. And that is the one that we could do something about. And we have to if we're going to preserve the climate. But most of the future CO2 will be from coal because oil is beginning to run out. And we could decide that we're not going to use the coal, or we will use it only at power plants where we could capture the CO2 and sequester it. But that decision has to be made. And on the contrary, we're continuing to build more and more of these coal-fired power plants. And Minnesota is a good example. It's nominally a green state. The people want it to be a green state. And when you listen to the politicians, it sounds like they're going to make it that way, but in fact, they're allowing this Big Stone 2 coal-fired power plant to go ahead, and that is a big mistake, and I think we need to make that clear. Unless the public puts pressure on the policymakers, the things are not going to happen because policymakers are strongly influenced by the special interests who, unfortunately, money has a big influence in capitals, national capital and state capitals. And so the public needs to make clear that they want this problem to be solved. And it could be solved, but it's not going to happen unless it gets the priority that it deserves. The most critical thing is to realize that we have to have a moratorium on coal-fired power plants until they capture the CO2 and sequester it. That's the most important thing, but we do need energy, so that means we're going to need to encourage renewable energies and energy efficiency. So for example, we need to change the rules for utilities so that they can make more money when they help us save energy. Economists will agree that if you want to reduce the use of carbon-based fuels and increase the use of renewable energy, then you should have a price on carbon emissions. That's the logical way to do it, to then let the alternatives compete. So we should have a gradually increasing carbon price. It shouldn't end when we should give that money back to the public. Otherwise, the public is going to object very strongly to any, in effect, a tax. That's what it would be. But we could have 100% dividend in which the entire amount of money that is collected is returned to the public on a monthly basis, just deposited in their banking accounts. That way, the citizen who does better than average will actually make more money from the dividend than they pay in the tax. And that's the way to then drive the innovations, because people would have the money from the dividend to purchase new technology and reduce their emissions. Well, scientifically, the most compelling evidence comes from the history of the Earth. We see how the Earth responded in the past to changes in the boundary conditions, such as the atmospheric composition. But also, is just observations of what's actually happening now, especially in the polar regions. That's where Will Steger's observations are so important, because we can see that where this climate is most sensitive, at the poles, that the changes are beginning to be substantial. I had heard about Will many years ago, but last year I met him for the first time, and his presentations are so enormously impressive to see. You can see what's happening. He shows the animals in the polar regions. It's enormously impressive. Of course, that's why I made the trip out here, because it's very hard to turn down his request.
That's great.
But yeah, I think that it's that sort of thing which gives me hope that people will understand and will begin to make the changes that are needed. Scientifically, if you ask the National Academy of Sciences, they tell you that the evidence is now overwhelming. Climate is changing. Humans are the primary cause of those changes. But politically, there is this give and take. But in fact, if you look, the public can also, there's plenty of data not just at the poles. For example, alpine glaciers, mountain glaciers are melting all around the world. That's one of the important impacts, because hundreds of millions of people are dependent upon the fresh water from these mountain glaciers, and they're going to be gone within 50 years if we stay on business as usual. But other things are becoming obvious also. The expansion of the subtropics is affecting climate in the southern United States, in the Mediterranean region, and in the southern hemisphere in Australia and southern Africa. And we see in the United States, for example, the area burned in forest fires has increased by a factor of 4. Part of that is due to our policies of putting out the fires and therefore increasing the fuel. But in fact, it's mainly due to the changing in the climate. And you can see that in Canada and Siberia, where they don't have these policies to put out the fires. Their areas burning have increased dramatically in the last few decades. The tundra region in Canada and Siberia is beginning to melt and release methane. And last year, for the first time in the last 6 or 8 years, atmospheric methane began to increase again, probably in part because of this melting tundra. It's another example of where we can't afford to have continuing business as usual, because we will pass that sort of tipping point and the system will then get out of our control. And that the fruits of that will be borne by our children and grandchildren, unfortunately. It's important for young people to understand what the situation is and to begin to put pressure on the system. They need to get involved in the democratic process and make clear that this is an important issue, because their futures and their children's futures will depend upon this problem being solved in the near future. If we just talk about the science, if I talk about climate change, Will's going to the Arctic and showing what's actually happening now, I think makes the message much clearer. We can talk about the science and about the theory, but you need to see what is really happening. And that is what he shows so wonderfully. And also, he is successful in getting young people and educators, and that's what we have to do, so that the next generation realizes what is at stake. And I think the combination of the science and the explorer part is what is very effective. The way to help motivate them, at least from a scientific point of view, is to help them understand the science and the fact that the system has these long time constants. We put up the gases now and we don't see the effects, the full effects, for several decades. So what we're doing is creating a problem for the younger generation, and they need to be aware of that, and they are becoming aware of that, and they should demand that we do something about it. Public education is essential because otherwise the most important thing that people can do is influence the political process, because there have to be fundamental changes, and they can't be solved by the individuals by their own actions. We're going to have government standards and changes that can only be made at the national and international level.